Hello! And ho, ho, ho! Which, incidentally, was my nickname in high school. It wasn't. I wasn't that cool. Before we start the show, I just wanted to say something about what's happening still in Palestine. What we're covering in the show at the moment and in this episode is very important for the long term, and it's important concepts that Christians should get behind, but I didn't want to publish the show without talking about what's happening in Palestine right now still. 19,000 people dead in Gaza, bombing still happening, the ground assault still happening, reports of snipers killing women in churches, just awful reports coming out. And I don't know if you've seen any of the video footage of Sky News reporters being near the bomb blast and just seeing the effect that this is having on the actual human beings, regardless of your theology on Israel. And I do believe that Christian Zionism is incredibly problematic theologically, but regardless of it, you cannot support this kind of shooting and bombing and killing of civilians in the cause of catching any kind of terrorist. It's just not acceptable. So if you have the ability to call an MP or a congressman, woman, person, representative, I don't know, what do you call them, senators? Do you call your senator? I have no idea. If you have the ability to call a representative and you live in a democracy that is supporting Israel, please do it. Send emails, but phone them as well and leave messages. Let them know that we want the support for this to stop. And maybe talk to your pastor if they're thoughtlessly pro-Israel and thoughtlessly kind of push these kind of tropes. It's not acceptable, and we can't be a part of this. We all have a responsibility to fight it. Anyway, just wanted to say that before we go into something which is fascinating and interesting. Thanks for listening, and happy Christmas. Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's John T.
I'm Matt.
Hey, Matt, thanks so much for joining us. If you're a regular listener, you may realize that we are missing both Malky and Laura. The Christmas season and COVID have meant that they can't be with us, which is very sad. But Matt has very kindly come on the show to talk to us. Since it's around Christmas, we've decided to talk about the big man with the beard who wants to give good things to everybody, Karl Marx. We're actually talking about socialism and Christianity and some kind of just basic misconceptions that a lot of Christians have, and that the church perhaps teaches, and that we're hoping in this episode we're going to kind of give you some answers to some of the objections you may have heard commonly. So, But before we do that, Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thanks a lot for having me on. Also, great excuse to grab a beer at 3:30 my time. So,
and also tell us what you're drinking. Very important.
I'm drinking a Michigan Christmas Ale. For your readers who don't know, Michigan is starting to get a little bit into like the craft brew season. Normally, I wouldn't splurge on something like that, but it is the holidays. So, cheers.
Merry Christmas. And I'm drinking a Hitchcock cider, and it's also lovely. So,
Yeah, it does. I remember. I lived in Ireland and UK for a while, and you guys have some amazing beers. Let me tell you that.
We really do. Well, tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and what your connection is to this kind of intersection of socialism and Christianity.
Sure. So I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, although I'm originally from Canadian, right? Grew up in Stittsville, Ontario, represent, right? And in terms of my background with Christian socialism, it was actually a bit of a difficult path for me to reach, because for a long time now I've been a leftist, right? Not initially, right? I was a bit more of a kind of centrist, idiosyncratic person, but definitely since, my early 20s. But I lost my faith, certainly my Roman Catholic faith, around the time when I was, 17, 18, for all the typical reasons, you know what I mean? Like I was frustrated by the homophobia of the Catholic Church, which was pretty rampant in my town, let me tell you. Also really didn't like its defense of hierarchy, conservatism, and certainly in my town, capitalism. Especially like a really brutal form of capitalism. Then I read a lot of Nietzsche, read a lot of Camus, did all the typical, highfalutin stuff, and just decided, well, now I'm, if not an atheist, definitely leaning in that direction. But gradually over time, I became re-enamored, certainly with Christian ethics and the spirituality of the Bible. And like a lot of people, I still struggle with many aspects of my faith tradition, trying to understand what God wants from me, what, is required from me morally. But I've now come to appreciate that there is a way for me to harmonize my religious and spiritual beliefs with my politics in a way that my 18-year-old self would have found pretty baffling. So I'm quite grateful for that.
That's fantastic. And how did you come to that conclusion? Like, who were you reading? What were the influences?
Well, there were a few different people, really, right? One of them was Soren Kierkegaard, right? Who I was just like obsessed with, like a lot of young people were through my 20s. Because even though, I was, if not an atheist, at least again, agnostic, I really found his probing of spiritual and personal issues very, very, very edifying, right? In fact, I almost got lost in them for a little while. But what always troubled me about them was this very kind of Protestant, almost narcissistic emphasis on internality and subjectivity. Now, I understand that that's what Kierkegaard is all about, so I'm not going to go too hard against him. He was better at doing that than anybody else. But I always felt like I need to have something that's a little bit more focused on the external world, right? What our ethical obligations are to other people, rather than just, what our faithful obligations are to God, as a singular individual. And over time, I started to discover a rich Christian socialist tradition that really found powerful ways of integrating the message of the gospel and the message of a humane, ethically minded socialism. And that's how I started to transition, right? Now, this is for all of us, right? Not a end point for me, right? It's still something that I'm inquiring into. And I myself have a lot more to learn. If you want, I just finished reading a great book by Gary Dorian on the religious roots of social democracy in the United Kingdom and Germany. So that was very edifying for me, right? But, I'd say maybe around 2019, 2018 is when I started thinking of myself as a liberal Christian socialist, I should say.
So, I mean, when I started talking to some friends about this, and I was like, we've never actually done an episode that focuses on socialism itself. And I think among myself and my co-presenters, it's kind of a given for us that we are socialists, we hold to socialist beliefs. But whenever we go kind of outside of those, friendly socialist bubbles or leftist bubbles or whatever, and especially within the church, you say that, and sometimes people can look at you like you're actually crazy. And I wanted to put to you some of the things that are, and I thought this would be a fun and kind of helpful thing for our listeners, of some of the things you hear most often when you start talking about this. And I imagine you'd have your own ones, but if I can start by putting a few to you and just saying, what do you think of this argument? And is there an answer to that? The first one is always, I think that it's more of a baseline assumption than something that is stated out loud. But I have heard this before as well when I've been, having debates with people on this kind of topic, which is socialism is basically communism, and communism is violently anti-Christian and is also a murderous death cult. So, how can a Christian possibly be for that? If you are for socialism, you are for Stalin's purges, is kind of the jump that gets made. And I think within there's maybe a reasonable thing because of like, well, is socialism, is it inherently atheistic, and is it a hostile atheism to Christianity? Would be my question.
Yeah, those are two great questions. And I think they're the two that Christian socialists, however they understand themselves, need to spend a lot of time answering, right? In addition to all kinds of theological queries, right? So maybe I'll bracket it into two, and then I'll try to answer each independently. On the question of communism, Stalinism, Leninism, I do think that's something that all people who identify as socialists need to take seriously, right? That's not to say that, liberals and certainly people on the right don't also have a huge amount to answer for. So there's a bit of hypocrisy whenever people try to say, well, think about the gulags, but then don't talk about, the vast exploitation of North America and the genocide of indigenous peoples, or, fascism, death camps, and all those kinds of stuff. Yeah. But, I would say that, any socialist contemporaneously should emphatically reject the Stalinist, Leninist, and Maoist models. I think that's just a given, right? And I have no problem saying that those were authoritarian regimes that were murderous to the umpteenth degree, and I have no sympathy for them as institutions, although I have a huge amount of sympathy, of course, for their victims, right? Now, I would caveat that by saying, look, those are forms of communism or leftism that I have no truck with, right? But there's many other forms of socialism out there, right? It's an extraordinarily rich and diverse tradition. So, ethical socialism and social democracy and democratic socialism were in many ways, the original anti-authoritarian communists, right? Or opposed to authoritarian communism because they saw where it was going. And they decided that they were going to establish a different approach to socialism in the countries, say, of Western Europe or in Canada, where I'm from. And this approach to socialism was highly democratic, deeply respectful of individual as well as social rights, and it produced some of the most enduring and important institutions that people cherish today, right? I always point, for instance, to in the United Kingdom. It was socialists that gave the United Kingdom its beloved institution, the NHS, right? More beloved than the monarchy, right? More beloved than the Queen, God rest her soul, right? So that's really saying something, right?
Yeah.
So if people can appreciate the diversity of liberalism, which I think we should, or the political right, which we also should, then by all means, we should be appreciative of the diversity of socialist institutions, parties, movements, ideologies out there, and recognize that while some of them were very bad, some of them produced extraordinary results for people. And I think we need a lot more of that, please. Now, in terms of the more important theological question about the connection between socialism and the gospel and Christianity, right? There are two things to be said about this. First off is that many early socialist movements, including some of the earliest, were Christian in their orientation, particularly, interestingly enough, in the United Kingdom, right, where you had important Christian socialists like Maurice or R.H. Tawney, who's a big influence on me, right, who were formative influences on the workers' movement, the Labour Party, you name it, right? But on the deeper question, I think that a lot of this reputation of socialism for being militantly atheistic comes from Karl Marx, right? Now, Karl Marx was a profound critic of religion, and I think it's important to appreciate that, right? He wasn't kind of Richard Dawkins atheist, where the only interesting thing that he really has to say is, well, there's no God, so stop believing in it, right? Marx insisted that religion serves an important social function in the world, and it needs to be appreciated and understood that way, not just dismissed because from his perspective, it's metaphysically wrong. If you read On the Jewish Question, problematic essay, certainly for its title, he does declare that religion is the opiate of the masses and that the critique of religion is the start of radicalism. But he also calls religion the heart of a heartless world, right? And essentially says, look, it's no surprise that in a world that is so riven with exploitation and suffering and injustice as ours, of course, people are going to project certain kind of religious ideals that they want the world to aspire to. How could they not, right? So if you are an atheist from his perspective and you want religion to disappear, doing the Richard Dawkins thing of just saying, stop believing in it. It's not going to happen as long as we live in an unjust world. And there's this psychological and social need for God that's omnipresent across, space and time. So whatever you think about this, right, it's a much more nuanced approach to religion than, the vast majority of atheists out there. And I do think it contains a core truth about why it is that many people yearn for God, right, which is the fact that oftentimes we project ideals onto our society that our society just does not live up to, right? And that we have a moral responsibility to try to make our society live up to its highest ideals.
Absolutely. And I think if you then take that a step further, what would you say to the concern among Christians who say, well, if that's true, then a world where we've solved social problems means we don't need the church? And I don't think people are as grotesque as to say that in as many words, but I have heard people saying all this extra need means we have more opportunity to witness, even from churches that are into their, social programs and are doing social justice work and are feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the prisoner. The sense that socialism might replace religion, might replace what the church is doing in terms of good works. Is that a legitimate fear? Because it feels ghoulish to me, but I don't know. I mean, I've already kind of picked a side, No,
I understand this, right? And I think this is related to a deeper philosophical dispute between some versions of Christianity and socialism, which is this idea that Christianity is committed to a notion of people as inherently sinful and the world as intrinsically, if not fallen, at least characterized by suffering. And that's juxtaposed against this utopian feeling that some socialists have that, when we institute fully automated luxury communism or acid communism or whatever, all the bad aspects of human life are going to disappear. We will all become extraordinarily friendly and good to one another. And, manna will rain down from heaven, right? Now, there is without a doubt versions of socialism that approximate this kind of utopian language, right? Marx himself was very critical of them, in any kind of version of utopian socialism. But I think that at its best, socialists actually shared a view of Christian human nature that is very deeply aligned with, let's say, the Augustinian view of human nature, right? Where they felt that the reason and the best argument for socialism is precisely that human nature is radically fallen. And that power can be extraordinarily corrupting. And that includes vast concentrations of economic power, particularly when vast concentrations of economic power can lead to further concentrations of economic and political power, like we've seen right now. So the argument for socialism is that we need to negate these kinds of concentrations of power precisely because human nature can be so radically fallen that we cannot trust people in those kind of situations to exercise that authority responsibly. They will most likely exercise it in order to achieve dominion over others. And that is not compatible with should not be compatible, I should say, with the aspirations of any Christian society.
It is kind of hilarious because that cliche you hear is that communism works in theory, but it doesn't take into account human nature, where to my mind, communism or socialism do take into account human selfishness and say, we can't really rely on people just doing the good things spontaneously en masse. So, you've got to make the systems fairer. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I would say so, right? Now, again, there are certain variants of socialist and communist thinking that sometimes do just project this idea that, once we overcome class conflict and transition to a higher form of society, then, everything will be peanuts. But I don't think that you would see any intelligent socialist, certainly not any intelligent Christian socialist, that would make that argument. In fact, if you look at the history, certainly of early 20th century and mid 20th century Christian socialism, as embodied in the writings of people like Paul Tillich, right? Who lived through the Nazi regime and had to flee Germany, or Martin Luther King, right, who, let's just put it this way, right, knew a little bit about oppression and how dark human beings and how evil human beings could be to one another. There's no sense of that, right? There's a recognition that a just and humane society where power is more evenly distributed will remove a lot of the temptations, not to do evil to one another, because that will never disappear, but to inflict mass evil upon one another. And I can't think of anything that is more aligned with the aspirations of the Bible than some project like that.
Absolutely. Another argument you hear quite a lot within the church is that the idea of forced virtue, particularly forced generosity, negates it as a virtue and is therefore anti-Christian. So if you are taxing me so that the poor can be helped and their medical bills can be taken care of or their needs met, then you are taking away from me the opportunity to do good to those people by choice. And that is at a kind of, transcendental level wrong. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think that this is predicated on a deeper misunderstanding of the nature of the society that we have, right? Because there is this libertarian or possessive liberal view that capitalism is somehow a natural system that emerges spontaneously from people's individual choices, and that socialism involves the imposition of some kind of artificial system of the good over and above the kind of choices that individuals would make for themselves. Nothing could be less true than that, right? First off, it's very important to note that capitalism was born through an enormous amount of bloodshed and war and primitive accumulation, if you want to use the Marxist term. And a lot of that continues, right? The market system that we have right now, including respect for private property, is predicated on an immense amount of state coercion, right? To lead people to respect legal property rights. And indeed, it's become more expansive than ever before, where now we don't even have the state that simply uses coercion to enforce property rights the way that, say, Marx or Engels would have understood it. We have vast international institutions, right, that are designed to protect property wherever it goes around the globe and beyond, right? If you think about, Elon Musk and Bezos, trying to get into space and claim asteroids for themselves, right? So I would say that the premises of that question are incorrect, right? Because any kind of social order that we establish is going to preempt certain kinds of actions and disqualify others. The question is only which kind of actions are we going to try to catalyze and which ones are we going to try to stop. And I think that we should be trying to incentivize people to be good to one another through, the institution of social programs and the democratization of the economy, rather than what we have right now, which is a social system that uses coercion to foster a lot of the more negative elements in human nature. Right now, again, I want to stress, I do not think that with a transition to a liberal, democratic, socialist society, the sort that I'm, find appealing, that, all the nastiness of human nature would disappear, right? People would still cheat on their wives and husbands. There'd still be, awful people that would say terrible things about one another on Twitter, and, any other social media.
There would still be Twitter?
X, yeah, well, maybe that's, would be another argument we can make for democratic socialism, right? X would disappear.
That'd be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it would be. But, people would still treat each other like crap in their private life. I just think that, to use a famous phrase, we would replace the systemic causes of human unhappiness and human evil with more normal and more personalized forms of evil and cruelty. And that would be a big improvement in many ways.
I was on a panel discussion in South Africa last year where I was the kind of designated commie in a church that did not have a lot of those people, very kind of middle-class white South African church. And I remember them being, and the person who I was mostly talking, against on the panel, just talking about, but is there really systemic injustice? Because it seems like in a liberal democracy, there's freedom, there's no need for systemic change, because if you just work hard enough, you'll be able to be the president or Elon Musk or whatever. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's a pretty ridiculous claim, right? It's pretty ridiculous, and it's been known to be ridiculous for a long time, right? Take a and this isn't just something that radical communists understood. It's also something that major proponents or major figures in the liberal tradition understood, right? So let's just take two as emblematic. So John Stuart Mill, right, who identified as a socialist, I should note, near the end of his life, wrote a very interesting tract called Socialism, where he was critical of some of the more authoritarian variants of socialism out there, rightly so. But he was also extremely critical of this idea that we live in a meritocracy where everyone starts at the same starting point and just kind of competes. And those who rise to the top do so through their own efforts. And those who wind up at the bottom, well, you had a chance to make it there. Mill, in the 19th century, said, what a ridiculous notion, right? Anybody with eyes to see could recognize that some people are born into conditions of extraordinary poverty and disadvantage. And oftentimes, he pointed out, these are the people who end up working hardest in their life, right? They're the people who end up doing 2 jobs, 3 jobs even, right? Just in order to keep a roof over their head. Whereas, a couple of other people wind up in positions of extraordinary advantage through no, virtue of their own, and they don't have to do a goddamn thing through their entire life, right? They just sit there with a trust fund, and they live off the interest that trust fund produces, right? So he says, even on the problematic basis that many of these classical liberals argue for, even on the problematic basis of classical liberalism's own ethical framework, this seems inherently contradictory, right? Because the people who work hardest in their society or who labor the most end up getting the least, and the people who often labor the least end up getting the most, right? Which is deeply contrary to even the Lockean notion that, work should correspond with reward in some bizarre sense, right? Or you can move forward to somebody like, say, F.A. Hayek in the 20th century, right? Now, F.A. Hayek is obviously not a socialist, right? He's a great critic of socialism, and he's somebody the left needs to deal with very seriously as an intellectual opponent, right? But in one of his less known arguments, he actually is extremely critical of this idea that we will ever live in a meritocracy, right? In fact, he tellingly says that meritocracy isn't the opposite of an aspiration for social justice. It's just its mirror image, right? Because where socialists say we should have a society that's fair, where, the people who work hardest get treated fairly. Conservatives or classical liberals will say we need to have a society where the deserving get ahead, right? Where, through your own efforts you will rise, and through your own efforts you will fall, and that's what our economy reflects. And Hayek said, what a ridiculous idea. Again, anyone with eyes to see could tell you that some people work 50, 60 hours a week in, our economy, and they'll live in, a one-bedroom apartment, that they'll share with 5 other people. That's just, the way the market operates. Other people, again, won't do a goddamn thing, or they'll just get lucky and they'll make millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and retire to some Cayman island somewhere and drink margaritas all day, right?
Yeah.
The market economy is not the hand of God. It does not allocate to people what they deserve in some kind of theological way, right? So if the two most significant liberals of 2 different centuries could recognize what a ridiculous idea meritocracy is, alongside, a lot of different socialists, then really there is no basis for any sensible person buying into it anymore, right? It's kind of like a belief in Santa Claus, right? This idea that good children will get toys and bad children won't get anything. They'll get, a hole in their stocking, right? Meritocracy is nice in the same way that believing in Santa Claus is nice, but at a certain age, you should really just give it up.
I love that. It's like a lot of the conversations I remember having in university when I would say, but in South Africa, redistribution of wealth should probably happen. And your classic kind of white South African thing is, but, they worked hard for that. And I'd always be like, oh, did they work as hard as the dude down the mine? Because I feel like he works harder than I've ever worked or ever want to work, as a kind of soft middle class boy, you know what I mean? And yet he's never going to have the wealth that I had by doing a Bachelor of Arts degree. How is that a meritocracy? It seems like it seems so obviously untrue. Why is it so hard for people to see? Is it just that the propaganda was good in the Cold War?
I think that's a big part of it, right? And there's no doubt that the workmanship ideal, as it's sometimes called, this idea that, through your own efforts you will rise or through your own indolence you will fall, has been pervasively popular for centuries now, right? But I think that in some ways it is rooted in a dark aspect of human nature, right? Max Weber put this very well, where he pointed out that it's very often inadequate for fortunate people just to appreciate their good fortune, right? They need to, in some ways, feel deep down that they deserve it, right? That somehow the universe is rewarding them for their intrinsic merits or their intrinsic qualities, right? Now, whatever you may think about this, the dark side of it, of course, is that the inverse of this view has to be that, well, if I deserve to be wealthy and powerful and enjoy, extraordinary amounts of status and privilege, then the people at the bottom must also deserve to be where they are. And there have been all kinds of rationales developed over the course of history to justify exactly this position, right? That these people, to use Aristotle's term, are just natural slaves, right? They're dumb. They're only fit for cleaning toilets, and people who clean toilets don't need to get paid very much. Indeed, they don't even need to get paid anything at all. They should just appreciate their servitude and any kind of privileges that come from that, right? Or you can think about various forms of racism, whether in South Africa or the United States, where people would say, look, these people are just mentally deficient. Again, they should be grateful for what they have. And also we should retain a system of slavery or a system of racism, because it really makes white people feel good to imagine that they exist, to use one antebellum apologist terms, in a system of infinite remove from those below them, and they can appreciate this distance between themselves and others. And I think as long as this yearning to feel that one's privilege, status, and wealth are deserved, and inversely, that the people at the bottom also deserve their lot, we're always going to have to struggle as socialists to try to push for a more fair society. But in some ways, we have an advantage, which is that oftentimes, as you pointed out, people don't deserve where they wind up in life, right? It's purely arbitrary or accidental if it's not the result of long systems of discrimination and prejudice, right? Certainly that's the case in South Africa, right? Yeah. And once one acknowledges that, a lot of the arguments beyond, emotional appeals for extraordinary distinctions of well-powered status just evaporate, I'd say.
I find it always so strange, the aversion to the welfare state, or any kind of unemployment benefit, free health care, any kind of, my taxes go to helping these people who, for whatever reason, I'm now supporting them. In a religion that talks as much about grace as evangelical Christianity does, which is our entire faith is predicated on undeserved goodness, and yet there's not there's not an acknowledgement that that should be the way society works. And I think, you can say that that's all just, I don't know, kind of theological blindness. But I think one of the things that you hear quite often is, no, I'm fine for people who don't deserve it to get good things. It just shouldn't come from the government. This fear of centralizing power, this fear of government. Where do you think that comes from, and what is an answer to that objection?
Well, I think there are a number of different answers to that objection. In terms of where this fear of government comes from, I think that R.H. Tawney, a great Christian socialist, provides a very good answer in his work on the religious origins of capitalism, right? So looking at the United Kingdom, for example, he points out that early forms of capitalist ideology emerged out of various different Protestant denominations in the 17th century, particularly in response to the Civil War. And one of the things that he points out is it didn't have to be this way, right? So, for instance, the levelers adopted this view that people should work hard, right? They were attached to a version of the workmanship ideal. But they said, look, the reality is that the peasant class or the lower middle class in this country are the ones that do most of the work. And then you have the aristocratic rich or, wealthy businessmen, and they don't work very hard, right? So they should, have to pay their fair dues by establishing various kind of redistributive mechanisms. Wasn't a very popular argument with those people, and so consequently Cromwell repressed them. Not hard to imagine, right? But Tawney points out that this was always matched by another strain of Protestant thought that emphasized, look, you shouldn't blame anyone else for your circumstances, and you certainly shouldn't look at how someone else is doing, including the rich, right? Focus only on your own life, gratifying, God, according to your own measure, and don't pay too much attention to what's going on, politically, because that is just going to lead you down, the short route to hell. And what Tawney points out is that it was this view of Protestantism that eventually became ascendant in the United Kingdom, and for that matter, also in the United States. This kind of individualistic, insular, highly, highly competitive outlook that says, look, the goal of government isn't to establish a system of cooperation where everyone benefits. The goal of government is just to establish the preconditions for me to live my own life with minimal interference from others. And consequently, I am responsible for my own destiny, and I owe nothing to anyone else for that. Now, Tawney points out correctly that this has always been a mythology, right? Because these same people who will say things like, government should just leave me alone and let me pursue my own destiny, will also rabidly insist that it protect and use coercion to protect their private property rights. Right. And, also crush competition where it interferes with their business, establish tariffs where, it interferes with, national competitiveness, you name it. Right. But this outlook has never disappeared and has, in fact, become ubiquitous amongst the ruling classes, according to Tawney, of the United Kingdom and the USA of his day. And I think that a variant of this outlook is still very popular now. Right. And it's important, I would say, for Christians to recognize that this isn't something that is artificial. It grew out of a species of Protestant Christian thought. And so we need to be theologically critical of it, because I would say that it is a deviation from a proper understanding of Christian ethics, which, of course, is other-oriented, recognizes our obligation to the whole world generally, at its best, and isn't insular and individualistic, at least in this way.
Yeah, our neighbor is anyone who's in need, right? That's the Christian ethic, supposedly.
Yeah, exactly, right? Or think about, the gospel, right? It's not, the rich whom God sides with. It's the wretched of the earth, famously, who will know that God will be on their side, right?
Yeah. The classic Bible verse that gets trotted out is, if you will not work, you will not eat, and therefore welfare is bad, socialism is bad. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, first off, we have to recognize that the Bible always needs to be read holistically, particularly the New Testament, in terms of its overarching message, right? And certainly, there are fragments of the Bible that, I would not agree with, right? Or that I do not think are central to its core moral message. But I do think that read holistically, what comes through emphatically is a vision of social justice, where the meek are the most beloved children of God. And I think that that's true in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, right? So think back to, Abraham or Moses or excuse me, any of the other major prophets in the Bible. What characterizes their work is a deep concern with the status of the people as a whole, a resistance to slavery, certainly in the case of Moses and other forms of domination, and an insistence that a society needs to be established that is conducive to the ethical and spiritual well-being of all, but nonetheless retains a large amount of space for individual flourishing. So this is also important for an individual to have a personal relationship with God and be entitled to call out various forms of domination and corruption where they appear. And certainly by the time you get to the New Testament, right, Jesus is replete in his insistence that the Roman system of imperialism is doomed to decay, that again, the wretched of the earth are those who will know that God is on their side. And then, of course, that it's the meek and the poor who will inherit the kingdom of heaven because it's these groups, right, who are most beloved by God, right? I think that anybody who chooses to ignore all those lessons by focusing on idiosyncratic passages that say, work or starve, right, or render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, it's just reading a text in bad faith.
Yeah. I also think when you say you will not work, you will not eat, that's cool. But if you're going to apply that to people getting handouts or benefits or whatever it's called where you are, you have to apply that to people making money out of rent, right? You're not doing any work. You're just owning something. So you can't make money out of that. You can't make money as interest from your investments. You can't make money from investing in the stock market. You can't make money from owning things or having money because that's not work. That's not you doing any work. So as long as you oppose those things, you're at least at a kind of, you're being a little bit, what's the word? Coherent in your views, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And that was Tawny's entire point as well, right? That there were various earlier forms of Protestantism in the United Kingdom that stressed exactly that, right? That if you're going to insist that we need to be a society where everybody pulls their weight, then what about the idle rich? What about the aristocracy that languishes there in palaces and spends a huge amount of time just thinking like, well, I could add, an east wing and a few extra statues, and it would really, really brighten the place up, right? Yeah. These kinds of deviations from the workmanship ideal, again, as it's sometimes called, aren't the kind of things that conservatives and reactionaries pay attention to. If anything, they will often excuse them by saying, well, yeah, maybe this is a slight contradiction, but we need people engaging in these kinds of idle projects in order to cultivate higher forms of civilization, right? You very rarely hear them say things like, well, maybe the person who works 60 hours a week should live in something better than a one-room apartment with 5 other people. It's just not the kind of thing that they emphasize.
Yeah. So I met a lot of, I think, very nice, perhaps not very politically engaged Christians who've just kind of gone with the flow of what they've been taught politically in the church, either directly or kind of just by osmosis, who, when you talk to them about this stuff, are genuinely bothered by the inequality that you find in society, and who believe that the wealth should be shared, but are absolutely vehement that it should be done as charity and not through any kind of systemic approach. What do you say to those people? Because they seem absolutely convinced that only through personal charity is this legitimate. And they really want to see change, but they believe they should convince as many of their brothers and sisters as possible to also be generous, and then that'll change the world.
Well, I just would say that they just need to look at the Bible again, right? Most of the major figures in the Bible didn't just sit there and say, well, yes, this system of domination exists, or yes, my people are being exploited. But the way to deal with that is, through personal charity, trying to be a privately good person, and then just hoping in the long run that God liberates us, right? No, these are people that took it into their hands to try to liberate the Hebrews from the Egyptians, right? At God's command, clearly.
Yeah,
right?
Moses doesn't just go around handing out bread.
Yeah, exactly, right? And Jesus didn't either, right? Yeah. Jesus was clearly pacifistic and didn't believe in violence. And I should add, as socialists, we could have a serious debate about that, right? Whether reformism or revolution is the right approach to try to institute social change. I tend to support reformism because I genuinely am pretty pacifistic, right? Not in all cases, but broadly speaking, right? But Jesus clearly envisioned a change in the social order that would be brought about by the arrival of God's kingdom. And again, one that would catalyze God's love for the least well off, or the wretched of the earth, or the meek and the humble, however you want to frame it, right? So this idea that the Bible is apolitical, or is just meant to be interpreted as a private system of ethics, runs very contrary to, I think, again, any good faith reading of the text. It also runs contrary, I should add, to about 1,700 years worth of interpretations of the Bible, including those that the major figures within it themselves gave, right? So I just don't know how you could sustain such a reading.
Absolutely. I'm just looking at my list of other questions. Yeah, it doesn't work in practice. It's never worked. It can't work. It's a lovely idea, but it's a fairy tale. So we shouldn't support the idea of socialism, which I think starts from a position of believing that capitalism works, which I think is a really weird idea. But yeah, thoughts on that?
Well, I would argue that in many places, socialist reforms have worked extraordinarily well, right? I mean, it's no coincidence that the Nordic social democracies are the most flourishing societies in the world right now. Now, these aren't strictly speaking purely socialistic, right? As many people within those societies will remind you, but they were very much the product of labor and workers' movements, right? That engaged in extraordinary amounts of militancy against some of the most aristocratic societies in Europe in the 19th century. Very important to remember that, right? Sweden was one of the most unequal societies in the world in the 19th century, and it was a union of farmers and industrial laborers militantly revolting against that brought about the profound changes that have since taken place, right? And when these parties took power, they instituted a lot of the reforms that socialists wanted, right? They catalyzed extraordinary amounts of support for unionization in many different parts of the economy. I mean, in some of these states, you'll still see union rates as high as 70%, right? Imagine something like that, right? They implemented co-determination models that require workers to have a say in how it is that firms over a certain size are going to be run. Of course, they established, very, very robust and very, very generous welfare measures that provision for everything from education to health to housing, to unemployment insurance and more, right? And, above all else, they changed the culture of a lot of these communities from one that emphasized, again, atomistic selfishness towards more central liberal values like a commitment to freedom for all, equality for all, and solidarity for all, right? And I would argue that those are the kinds of socialist reforms or social democratic reforms that we should be trying to re-implement and re-dignify today, right? And, again, we don't even need to look that far to see instances where these kinds of reforms work exceptionally well. Just look at the United Kingdom or Canada, for that matter, right? In the United Kingdom, it was the government of Clement Attlee that introduced the country's most beloved institution, the NHS. And to the extent that it's not working very well, it's precisely because we've seen generations now of reactionary governments that have defunded it, not treated it with respect, and have done everything that they can to delegitimate it and failed, at least in that one crucial respect. Or take Canada, right? Canada had a nationwide poll in the early 2000s where everybody figured Wayne Gretzky, then the greatest hockey player of all time, was going to be ranked the greatest Canadian of all time, and he would get my vote most days. But it was actually Tommy Douglas, right? The socialist premier and, member of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, now the NDP, who introduced the country's first public healthcare system, who was voted the greatest Canadian in all history, right? That really tells you something, right?
Greater than Gretzky. That's huge.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, it was controversial, let me tell you that, because Canadians, we love our hockey, right? Yeah. So when you take that into account, I would argue that in many ways, these kind of socialist reforms have established the most successful and flourishing societies in human history. Now, are they utopias? No, right? There's a lot of problems, in countries where socialist governments or social democratic governments have taken power. But I don't think that any sensible socialist, again, ever thought that we were going to establish some utopia where all human problems were going to disappear, because, again, human nature is what it is, right? It's crooked in many respects. But they are certainly more decent societies than what existed before. And the fact that we didn't continue on that path after Thatcher, Reagan, and a lot of other reactionaries took power really is the dark beginnings of a lot of the problems that we're facing right now.
And it's so hard to understand how somebody who loves Jesus and sees Jesus as an example of mercy and love and believes that God is love and believes that we're saved by grace, how they could see somebody getting life-saving medical care for free rather than being bankrupted or just dying as bad news. It's just so incongruent with everything I understand to be the spirit of Christianity. And personally, people who hold that incredibly weird right-wing view that would be bad, that socialized medicine specifically would be bad, who are kind, good people, but just it's do you think it is for most people who hold that view an integrated view, or is there some cognitive dissonance there?
No, I think that people who are opposed to socialism have a wide variety of different motivations behind this, right? Some of them are just self-interested, right? I mean,
yeah,
I've hung around with a lot enough,
yeah,
businessmen and finance bros and tech bros to know
people
that
who think they'll never need it.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
People who just think I'm Ayn Rand's Superman or whatever, and I made it, and fuck everybody else, right?
Yeah,
that's their problem.
real.
Deal with it. But I know a lot of people who are sincere in their moral convictions and have deep reservations about socialism for a wide array of different reasons. And socialists need to address those concerns seriously, right? Now, we shouldn't be shy in agitating for our position. And I don't think we should be relativistic either by just saying, well, that's your opinion and I have mine. We should say, no, this is what justice entails. But being respectful of people and answering their concerns sincerely is something that we could do a much better job at. And I think that we are in a lot of ways. I'm really proud of what a lot of, certainly the Canadian American left has done in the last couple of years. Very long way to go, but we're doing our best.
Yeah. What about the argument that if there's a safety net, there's no incentive for people to be ambitious, to strive, to work hard? And so shirkers and lazy people will take advantage.
Well, I think it's a ridiculous argument, right? Let's take a look at the German automotive sector, right? So the German automotive sector is one of the most competitive in the world. It also produces some of the finest cars in the world by wide acknowledgement, right? Now, I'm not a car guy, but I've been reassured of this by a lot of my friends who are
people
car
like
guys.
German cars, yeah.
They do, yeah, they do. And, it's worth noting that the German automotive sector is one of the most highly socialized in the entire world, right? Where, again, co-determination models have been introduced in a lot of the major auto sectors. Workers have a major say in how these companies are run, in strict contrast, right, to what's going on near where I live, very close to Detroit, right, where a lot of these people have been treated horribly, which is one of the reasons the big UAW strikes took place recently, right? And yet, these companies are highly competitive. Workers say that they're happy, and the cars they produce are fantastic, right? So I don't think that establishing a social safety net with robust and generous services and protections for other people in any way will disincentivize them from working or producing materials or commodities of a very high quality. In fact, I would argue that in many circumstances, giving people the education and skills that they need in order to develop their human powers, as Marx would put it, would be one of the preconditions for actually establishing a more flourishing and more functional economy, right? But, that's just me.
Yeah.
I suppose if you think that, we want everybody to be working at the same level as, a McPloy, then by all means, stick with the current economy.
It's also just so weird that on the one hand, they're like, I don't like socialism because it forces people. And then on the other hand, it's like, but I love the system where you should be afraid of starving to death. That for me is the ideal. Love that one because that's not force, that's choice, right? I'm like, how is that even a choice? It's so weird.
Absolutely, right. I mean, one of the moments that really triggered my turning to the left was actually when I was working at McDonald's for a couple of years, right? Now, I was 14, 15, and like you, I grew up in a middle-class family, so I had no intention of staying there forever, right? It was a summer job. My mom was like, you're going to fucking learn to work hard, so get in there and, you grill your burgers. And, I'm kind of grateful for that, too, She instilled a work ethic in me, so good on mom. But I met this woman there who was 40 years old. She'd been working at McDonald's for 25 years. And she just looked at me and she was like, God, I wish I had all this time back. I would have made such different choices. I feel trapped here, right? And that language of feeling trapped was something that really resonated with me because she was in a lot of ways. What are you going to do when you're 40 years old and you just had a fucking McJob your entire life, right? You're stuck there. And I can tell you, having worked there for a couple of years, that is not a place you would want to be for a month, let alone for 25 years, right? Yeah. And if we really wanted to establish a society where people were genuinely free, again, I think that means being committed to this idea that substantial freedom is just as, if not more important than the formal freedom to leave a career if you don't like it. Because as you pointed out, leaving a career to starve on the street isn't real freedom. In fact, it's kind of a mockery of the idea of freedom to suggest that it is.
Absolutely. So in terms of the change, you touched on earlier about reform versus revolution. Laura, who was sad she couldn't be here, said she wanted me to ask about the idea of the change that would be necessary, considering the vested interests, the wealth, and the power that is ranged against making a more equal society, any moves to even significant socialism. You know, somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, who I consider to be kind of center left, really, compared to say my own views, are going to be opposed with the dirtiest tricks possible. And there's so much against it that, you know, a lot of people just think, well, the only way this happens is in a revolution. But revolutions are very ugly. They can be violent. My fear of a revolution is that, without wanting to get into meritocratic or ghoulish kind of ways of thinking, but the wrong people will get killed, because they always do in revolutions, along with vast swathes of people who are to varying extents deserving of it. Not that I would say that, because I'm also mostly pacifist. But where do we stand? If a revolution comes, are the Christians meant to be there trying to protect everybody from getting killed? Are we meant to be going, well, overall, you know, you want to make an omelet, you gotta guillotine some nobles? Like, where do you think Christians should stand in that kind of situation? Because there's a lot of people who say it's coming a lot closer than it ever has been.
Okay, I mean, there are a couple of things that I want to say here. First off is, I think that this is a very serious question that leftists need to sometimes take more seriously than they do, right? A lot of us throw around revolutionary language without really thinking about what the connotations of that are. And I do think it's important to recognize that if taken seriously, that will lead to violence, destruction, and a lot of innocent people getting harmed. And I'm not okay with that, right? Now, saying that, the left is often tarnished with a fetish for revolutionary agitation that leads to, you know, guillotines or gulags or whatever it happens to be. People often forget or neglect to say that liberalism and liberal regimes were also born in revolution, right? I mean, in the United Kingdom, people will often neglect to recall that you executed your own king, right? And, you know, there was several civil wars and Jacobite uprisings and, you know, just immense amounts of insecurity between the middle of the 17th century and about, you know, the middle of the 18th century, when I think the last Jacobite uprising was put down, right? And all that was necessary for a transition to liberalism and capitalism, and it entailed immense amounts of violence. The same thing was true in the American revolutionary context, because as the name suggests, the United States, you know, launched a revolution against its legitimate and legal government in order to establish a new Republican regime. And of course, the same thing happened in France, South America, you name it, right? And, you know, the right is certainly not immune to the temptations of, let's just put it this way, a couple of coups d'etats, Spanish civil wars, counter-revolutionary violence, you name it, right?
And the occasional capital insurrection.
And the occasional capital insurrection, might happen again, since there's going to be an election here next year, right? So again, this attempt to kind of tarnish the left with a reputation for violence or a taste for violence, while, you know, liberalism and the right just don't have any kind of responsibility or any kind of guilt for very similar practices, I think is just, again, in bad faith. Now, in terms of your practical question of what should we do right now, broadly speaking, I'm opposed to revolutionary violence for all the reasons that you mentioned. Not in all circumstances, because, you know, let's be clear. If I was in, you know, South Africa, I would have supported Nelson Mandela in the mid-century. And, you know, if, you know, I was in the United States, you know, mid-century, I would have also been with Malcolm, right? Or at least I like to think so, right? Who knows what would have happened? Or, you know, in Germany, you know, 1930s, you know, if somebody was like, you know, should I take a gun, get a gun and start firing at the Nazis? I'd be like, no, you know, get two guns and, you know, see if you can do the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing to knock out as many fascists as you can as quickly as possible, right? But I think that we need to realize that there are serious risks in doing so, that it should be absolutely a last resort, and that where a democratic route to socialism is achievable, that is the one that we should take, right? Now, I don't have a formula for this, right? Because I don't think there is a formula. I think a lot of it depends upon context, what is strategically viable, how bad things are, and also just, the prospects of being successful, right, in either kind of circumstance. In the United States, I do think, for instance, there's a route to democratic socialism. Maybe that doesn't run through the Democratic Party, but that runs through really building a left movement around people like the Squad, for example. In Canada, we have a reasonably large social democratic party that came close to winning government in 2015. So that would be the route that I would go for. In the United Kingdom, you know more about what's going on there than I do, but
I think
it wasn't too long ago.
It wasn't too long ago, but I think what we're seeing here is the same as you've got there, where any kind of genuine leftism is being, if not purged from the party like it's happening here, then just stalled at every stage. And, paid lip service to, but then when you get into government, it's just too complicated, we're not going to do it. And a lot of the criticism even of the Obama administration was you achieved so little of what we would have liked. You did not stack the Supreme Court. You did not codify Roe v. Wade. You did none of that because you don't have the commitment that, frankly, Trump, for all of his proto-fascism, he got shit done because he actually cared about changing things. Now, for the worse, making things terrible. But the liberal left, the center left, unwillingness to make significant structural change seems to me to be driving particularly Gen Z absolutely wild with frustration. And you're finding a global underclass learning more and more about how the world works and becoming more and more not radicalized, but definitely educated, and unfortunately, not always with a leftist ideology. Often with a populist right-wing ideology, both of which can be powder kegs. And I guess it's just that thing of is it inevitable that it will eventually erupt into violence? Is there a chance it wins? And then is there a responsibility to make sure it goes in the right direction? I think of the John Brown thing of the sin of slavery can only be purged through violence and civil war. I don't know. Thoughts?
Well, again, if Gen Z is angry, then I want to say that I commend their anger and I approve it. And I think that we need a lot more of that because anger can be a catalyst for radical reform, right? So good on them, right? We millennials are pretty angry for a long time. And I think a lot of us still are. And we need to keep hold to that because, I'm very worried that, we're going to end up going the way that, the boomers did, our parents, frankly, right?
Gen X, we exist.
Well, good on you. You had some fantastic grunge music, so mad props for that.
That's all we got.
Well, it's not a little, right? I'm a big fan of grunge. But, I think that what you're talking about is a genuine problem, right? Because I think that there is this deep fear on the part of liberal parties that if they center-left parties like the Labour Party, in a hypothetical universe, a more center-left, Democratic Party. I think there's a fear on the part of major figures in those parties that if they push for radical reform, it's going to lead to them becoming increasingly unpopular, and that's going to lead to a huge backlash that will eventually benefit the right. I would actually argue that it's the failure to do anything radical that has contributed to the unpopularity of these parties for a very long period of time. Look at Biden's poll numbers right now, right? As you pointed out, Donald Trump launched a fucking insurrection against the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And he's still beating him in some polls. Yeah. Still, and the reason is because the perception of Biden amongst a lot of the population, quite rightly, is that he's gerontic. He hasn't done anything that's of particular note, and that all the problems that were in place when he took office, or indeed when Trump took office, are still there. They've just been papered over somewhat at best, right? And that's not a misperception. There's a lot of good reasons for people to feel that way. Contrast that with somebody like, again, FDR, right, who was militant in going after the very rich. And wasn't afraid to call out, the ruling elites, even though he was one. Or, contrast that with, again, in my country, somebody like Jack Layton, who was militant and fiery, and who led the New Democratic Party to its most successful electoral outcomes ever. The left doesn't have to be afraid of radicalism, and liberals don't have to be afraid of radicalism. What they need to be afraid of is coming across as unprincipled and like they don't have anything meaningful to offer people. Because if we don't come across as having something meaningful to offer people, then of course they're going to look to the right because, like you said, whatever else you can say about Donald Trump, or whatever you want to call the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom right now, they do have a philosophy and they do have a set of beliefs. Their philosophy is, the country is bad and we should make it worse, right? Because why not burn the country? Why not just burn everything down?
That's
right?
it. Yeah.
And I think that ultimately we can offer people something a lot better than let's just burn the country down and make everything worse for everyone.
Absolutely. I think it's that status quo politics that people are getting really tired of. And I think particularly in the UK, my concern is economically, even if a left-leaning government came in, they would have to be very far left in order to get the tax base that they would need to do anything to help the country and the majority of the population experience something better than they're currently going to. Whoever gets into power realistically is going to have a terrible time. They will not be able to make any significant change to the status quo in terms of people's experience of the cost of living, of the NHS. There's just too much debt to pay down. And if they're not going to go after a really high tax base, then that party becomes unelectable, I think, for 20 years, which is why I really hope the Labour Party loses in the next election, apart from the fact that they, are ideologically bankrupt. Whereas you mentioned FDR, you had 90% taxation on the richest under FDR, and you still had these legacy families of billionaires who are with us today being formed under that regime. Like, it's possible to still be a rich scumbag bourgeoisie under a 90% tax regime. Like, don't worry if that's what you worship. If you're that kind of bootlicker, we could still do it. We could still do it. And we could all have, healthcare that works and is good. It's just, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So a lot of my writing is about the political right and conservatism. Right. Shameless plug. People can check out my book, The Political Right and Equality, if they're interested in that. Right.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I often point out to people is I think that those of us who came up in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s can sometimes be almost fatalistic about the triumph of conservatism or the right. Because, that's been the last 40, 50 years, right? It's important to note that there's nothing that is preordained about this. If you were to read the writings of major conservative authors, I'm not talking about pundits, I mean like real intellectuals like Russell Kirk in the 1950s and, the 1960s, during the era of FDR, Clement Attlee, the social democratic movements emerging in Europe, and of course, above all else, right, the anti-colonial movements that liberated many countries from European imperialism and American imperialism. The sense that you get from a lot of these right-wing authors around this time is we are the doctrine of losers. That's Russell Kirk's opening to the conservative mind. He's like, conservatives have fought every battle against the left as well as they could, and we've lost every single one of them. Right. So in many ways, what I'm proposing is a conservative solution to a lot of problems, which is that we should go back to the 1950s and make conservatives feel like losers again, because there's nothing preordained about their victory. They have a bad philosophy that, again, tends to make everything worse for everyone, including, I would add, the very rich, if it turns out, as many people are predicting, that the environment just collapses, right? So we need to offer people something that is a lot better than what the Tory party in the United Kingdom is offering, which also just seems to be chaos at this point, right? What the Conservative Party in Canada is offering, and certainly what the Trumpified Republican Party is offering in the United States.
Absolutely. Matt, thanks so much for joining us. Remind people where they can find your writings and more of your stuff.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. You can check me out at the Bias magazine for the Institute for Christian Socialism if you're interested in that material. I also write a lot of stuff on the right for Commonweal magazine, which is a left Catholic magazine in the United States. Or, they can check me out in Jacobin magazine. I got all that stuff there too.
Fantastic. All great publications. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you want to find out more about Beer Christianity, you can find us at beerchristianity.co.uk. We're on Twitter, X, whatever, and Insta, Beer Christianity. You can search us. And we also have a newsletter on Substack, so you can find all of that stuff out. Also, we can't end this episode without saying Free Palestine and ceasefire now. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
That's the best.